Things just got tense when Johnny Depp didn't hold back against Whoopi Goldberg on The View. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and two very different perspectives meet in a way no one quite expected? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins the way many daytime segments do, with a calm and measured introduction on a set familiar to millions of viewers. The panel at The View is seated, the atmosphere relaxed but attentive, as the hosts prepare to welcome their guest. On this particular day, that guest is Johnny Depp, appearing to discuss his recent projects and reflect, as many guests do, on both his career and the public conversations surrounding his life. From the very start, there is a noticeable shift in tone compared to lighter segments. The introduction is respectful, even warm, but there's an undercurrent of seriousness. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting among the panel, leads with a composed but direct approach, setting the stage for a discussion that would gradually move beyond the usual promotional format. Johnny Depp enters the conversation calmly. His posture is relaxed but attentive. He listens closely, nodding occasionally as the hosts speak. His tone, when he begins answering questions, is measured and thoughtful, suggesting he is aware of the environment he's in and the nature of the audience watching at home. The first portion of the conversation stays on safe ground. The panel discusses his recent work, his approach to acting, and how he selects roles. Depp speaks in a reflective manner, emphasizing the importance of storytelling and creative expression. There's no tension yet, just a steady rhythm of questions and answers, the kind viewers expect from a daytime interview. But as is often the case on shows like this, the conversation begins to evolve. Whoopi Goldberg gently steers the discussion toward broader themes: public perception, media narratives, and how individuals navigate scrutiny in the public eye. It's not abrupt, but it is deliberate. She frames her question carefully, acknowledging the complexities of public life, while also raising the issue of accountability and how public figures are often judged in real time. Her tone remains calm, but there's a firmness in her delivery that signals a shift. The other hosts on the panel become slightly more still, listening closely. Johnny Depp responds without hesitation, but also without defensiveness. He takes a moment before speaking, as if choosing his words carefully. His answer begins with a general reflection on how narratives are shaped, particularly in today's fast-moving media environment. He speaks about the difference between perception and reality, and how difficult it can be to reconcile the two when you are constantly in the spotlight. At this point, the conversation is still respectful, but there's a subtle tension building. It's not in the words themselves, but in the pacing, the slight pauses, the way each person waits just a bit longer before responding. Whoopi Goldberg follows up, clarifying her point. She emphasizes the importance of responsibility, not just from the media, but from individuals as well. Her perspective is grounded in experience, and she speaks with a tone that suggests she's not challenging Depp personally, but rather engaging in a broader discussion. Still, the dynamic begins to shift. Depp leans slightly forward, his expression more focused now. He acknowledges her point, but gently pushes back. He explains that while accountability is important, so is fairness, and that in many cases, the full story isn't always presented. There's a moment where the two perspectives sit side by side, neither confrontational, but clearly different. The audience in the studio is quiet, attentive. You can sense that they recognize the shift as well. This is no longer just a promotional interview. It's becoming a conversation about principles, about how stories are told and understood. One of the other co-hosts briefly interjects, attempting to balance the discussion by adding another viewpoint. The tone remains controlled, but the conversation is now layered, with each participant bringing their own experiences into the mix. Whoopi Goldberg listens carefully as Depp speaks, occasionally nodding, but maintaining her position. When she responds again, her voice carries a bit more emphasis, not louder, but more deliberate. She reiterates that public figures have influence, and that influence comes with a certain level of responsibility. Depp's reaction is subtle but noticeable. He pauses again, this time slightly longer, before responding. His answer is calm, but there's a seriousness in his tone that wasn't there at the beginning of the segment. He explains that responsibility should be shared, not just by those in the spotlight, but also by those who report on and interpret their actions. It's at this point that the conversation begins to feel more like a genuine disagreement. Not heated, not argumentative, but clearly a moment where two individuals are expressing fundamentally different perspectives. The pacing of the show adjusts accordingly. The hosts are more careful with their timing, allowing each person to finish their thoughts. There are fewer interruptions, and when they do occur, they are gentle, meant to guide rather than redirect. The audience remains engaged, some leaning forward in their seats. There's no audible reaction, no applause or murmuring, but the attention in the room is palpable. As the segment continues, the discussion deepens. Depp shares a personal reflection, speaking about how public narratives have affected him. He does so without raising his voice or showing visible frustration, but the weight of his words is clear. Whoopi Goldberg listens, her expression thoughtful. When she responds, she acknowledges his experience, but brings the conversation back to the broader context. It's not about dismissing his perspective, but about framing it within a larger conversation about media, influence, and public discourse. This back and forth continues, steady and controlled, but undeniably serious. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't rely on dramatic moments, but rather on the substance of what's being said. And as part one comes to a close, what stands out most is not conflict, but contrast. Two individuals, both experienced, both articulate, presenting different views in a way that feels authentic to the setting of live daytime television. The tone has shifted, the stakes feel higher, and viewers watching at home are likely beginning to realize that this is not just another interview. It's a conversation that is unfolding in real time, with all the nuance and complexity that comes with it. As the segment continues, there's a noticeable shift in how carefully each word is being chosen, both by Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg. What began as a reflective discussion is now settling into a more deliberate exchange, where each response carries a bit more weight than before. The transition isn't abrupt. It happens in the way the conversation slows slightly, in the way the hosts begin allowing longer pauses between questions and answers. On The View, timing is everything, and moments like this are handled with a kind of quiet awareness by everyone at the table. One of the co-hosts briefly attempts to bring the conversation back toward familiar territory, asking Depp about how he separates his work from public commentary. It's the kind of question that could easily steer things back into a more traditional interview format. Depp answers respectfully, explaining that he's always tried to focus on the work itself, letting the performances speak rather than engaging too directly with outside noise. But even as he answers, the underlying topic doesn't fully fade. His response includes a subtle return to the idea of perception versus reality, reinforcing a point he's already made. It's clear he's not avoiding the earlier discussion. He's just approaching it from a slightly different angle. Whoopi Goldberg listens closely, her posture steady, hands folded loosely in front of her. When she speaks again, her tone remains even, but there's a clarity in her phrasing that suggests she wants to make sure her perspective is fully understood. She acknowledges what Depp is saying about focusing on the work, but gently questions whether that's always enough in a world where audiences are increasingly engaged with the personal lives of public figures. There's no accusation in her voice, but there is a quiet insistence. It's the kind of tone that invites a response without escalating the situation. Depp leans back slightly this time, taking in the question. His expression is thoughtful, and he nods once before responding. He explains that while he understands the audience's curiosity, there's a line between interest and assumption, a line that, in his experience, is often crossed. As he speaks, the studio audience remains silent but attentive. The energy in the room feels focused, almost concentrated, as if everyone is aware they're watching a conversation that's unfolding without a script. Another co-host interjects gently, attempting to broaden the discussion. She mentions how public conversations have evolved over time, especially with the influence of social media. It's a point that both Depp and Goldberg seem to acknowledge, though from slightly different perspectives. Whoopi Goldberg builds on that point, noting that with greater visibility comes greater scrutiny, and that navigating that reality is part of being in the public eye. Her tone suggests this is less about judgment and more about observation, something she's witnessed throughout her own career. Depp responds by agreeing in part, but again introduces a distinction. He emphasizes that scrutiny should still be grounded in fairness, and that the speed at which information spreads today often leaves little room for nuance or correction. There's a brief pause after he finishes speaking. It's one of those moments on live television where no one rushes to fill the silence. Instead, it lingers just long enough to signal that something meaningful has been said. Whoopi Goldberg nods, acknowledging his point, but when she responds, she brings the focus back to accountability. Not as a contradiction, but as a complementary idea. She suggests that both things can exist at the same time: the need for fairness and the need for responsibility. This is where the conversation becomes more layered. It's no longer about one idea versus another, but about how multiple perspectives can intersect, sometimes uncomfortably. Depp's next response reflects that complexity. He doesn't dismiss her point. Instead, he agrees that accountability is important, but adds that it should be based on complete and accurate information. His tone remains calm, but there's a firmness to his words that indicates how strongly he feels about this. The camera occasionally cuts to the other hosts, who are listening closely. Their expressions are neutral but engaged, reflecting the tone of the discussion. No one appears uncomfortable, but there is a shared understanding that this is a more serious moment than what viewers might typically expect from a daytime segment. At one point, a co-host attempts to lighten the tone slightly with a brief comment about how conversations like this are becoming more common in public forums. It draws a small, polite reaction from the audience, but the overall mood remains focused. Whoopi Goldberg then shifts slightly in her seat, turning more directly toward Depp. It's a subtle physical cue, but it signals that she's fully engaged in this exchange. She asks a follow-up question, this time more specific, about how he personally navigates moments when public perception doesn't align with his own experience. It's a thoughtful question, and Depp takes a moment before answering. He explains that it's not always easy, and that there are times when silence feels like the only option, even when it's difficult. He speaks about patience, about allowing time to bring clarity, even when the immediate response might be to correct or respond. As he speaks, his tone remains steady, but there's an underlying sense of sincerity that resonates with the audience. It's not dramatic, but it feels genuine. Whoopi Goldberg listens without interruption. When he finishes, she responds by acknowledging that approach, but also raises the point that silence can sometimes be interpreted in ways that may not reflect intent. It's not a challenge, but a consideration, another layer added to the conversation. Depp nods again, recognizing the point. He doesn't disagree, but he explains that every situation is different, and that decisions are often made based on what feels right in the moment, even if those decisions are later questioned. The exchange continues in this way, measured, thoughtful, and increasingly nuanced. There's no escalation in volume or tone, but the seriousness of the discussion is unmistakable. The audience remains quiet, but their engagement is evident in their stillness. This isn't a moment for applause or laughter. It's a moment for listening. As part 2 progresses, what becomes clear is that neither Depp nor Goldberg is trying to win the conversation. Instead, they are each presenting their perspective with clarity and respect, even when those perspectives don't fully align. And in a setting like The View, that kind of exchange stands out. It's not about confrontation, but about contrast, about how different experiences can shape different views, and how those views can be shared in a way that feels both honest and appropriate for a live audience. By the time the segment moves toward its next phase, the tone has fully shifted from a standard interview to a genuine discussion. The pacing is slower, the response is more deliberate, and the attention in the room more focused than when the segment began. It's clear that whatever comes next will continue in this same vein, calm, serious, and grounded in the realities of live television, where every word matters and every pause carries meaning. As the conversation moves further along, the tone remains steady, but there's a noticeable deepening in how both Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg approach their responses. What stands out now is not just the difference in perspective, but the way each of them is actively listening, taking in the other's point before choosing how to respond. On The View, moments like this tend to slow the pace of the entire table. The usual rhythm of quick exchanges and overlapping commentary gives way to something more measured. Even the co-hosts who typically jump in more frequently seem content to let this particular discussion unfold naturally. Whoopi Goldberg leans slightly forward again, her expression thoughtful. She brings the conversation back to a broader societal context, expanding on her earlier point about accountability. This time, she frames it less as a question and more as an observation, speaking about how audiences today often feel a sense of connection to public figures and how that connection can shape expectations. Her tone is calm, but there's a quiet emphasis in her words. She's not speaking abstractly. She's drawing from experience, both personal and professional. As she talks, the camera briefly cuts to Depp, who maintains eye contact, nodding subtly as he listens. When she finishes, there's a brief pause, one of those moments that feels longer than it actually is, simply because of the weight of what's been said. Depp takes a breath before responding, and when he does, his tone reflects a slightly more personal shift. He acknowledges the connection audiences feel, agreeing that it's real and significant. But he adds that the same connection can sometimes lead to assumptions that aren't always accurate. He speaks carefully, choosing words that don't dismiss the audience's perspective, but still make his point clear. There's a subtle change in his body language now. Earlier, he leaned back more frequently, but at this point, he's more forward-facing, more engaged in the exchange. It's not defensive, it's focused. One of the co-hosts gently interjects at this point, offering a bridging comment. She notes that both perspectives seem to be pointing toward the same challenge: how to balance public interest with personal reality. It's an attempt to find common ground, and it briefly softens the intensity of the moment. Whoopi Goldberg nods in agreement with that framing, but she doesn't move away from her position. Instead, she builds on it, emphasizing that with influence comes impact, whether intended or not. Her voice remains even, but the phrasing is deliberate, suggesting she wants to ensure that point lands clearly. Depp listens, then responds with a measured acknowledgement. He agrees that impact is real, but reiterates that intent and context matter just as much. He explains that without context, actions and words can be interpreted in ways that don't reflect their original meaning. At this point, the conversation reaches a kind of equilibrium. Both sides clearly expressed, neither dismissed, but not fully aligned either. The audience remains attentive, and while there's still no audible reaction, there's a sense of quiet engagement throughout the studio. It's the kind of atmosphere where viewers at home are likely leaning in, listening closely rather than reacting outwardly. Another co-host takes the opportunity to ask a slightly more direct question, one that brings the conversation closer to personal experience again. She asks Depp how he feels when narratives about him circulate that don't match his own understanding of events. It's a question that shifts the focus inward, and Depp's response reflects that. He pauses longer this time, his expression more serious. When he answers, his voice remains calm, but there's a noticeable weight behind his words. He speaks about the difficulty of watching a narrative take shape without being able to fully influence it. He describes it not as frustration, but as a kind of detachment, an understanding that once something enters the public sphere, it often takes on a life of its own. Whoopi Goldberg listens closely, her expression softening slightly. When she responds, there's a subtle shift in her tone. Not a change in perspective, but a recognition of the personal dimension Depp has just introduced. She acknowledges that experience, noting that it's something many public figures can relate to in different ways. But she also gently returns to her earlier point, suggesting that navigating that reality is part of the broader responsibility that comes with visibility. There's no tension in the sense of raised voices or sharp interruptions, but the seriousness of the exchange is unmistakable. Each response builds on the last, creating a layered conversation that feels grounded and real. At one point, Depp offers a brief example, not overly detailed, but enough to illustrate his point. He speaks about how quickly a single moment can be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on who is telling the story. His tone remains steady, but the example adds a tangible element to what had previously been a more abstract discussion. The co-hosts react with quiet acknowledgement, some nodding, others simply listening. It's clear that the conversation has moved beyond surface-level commentary into something more reflective. Whoopi Goldberg responds to the example by emphasizing the importance of perspective, how different viewpoints can coexist, even when they don't fully agree. She frames it as part of the broader conversation society is having about information, interpretation, and understanding. Depp agrees with that idea, but adds that coexistence of perspectives should also include room for correction and clarity. His wording is careful, but the message is consistent with what he's been expressing throughout the segment. As this part of the discussion continues, the pacing remains slow and deliberate. There are fewer attempts to redirect or lighten the tone, and more emphasis on allowing each person to fully express their thoughts. The studio audience remains quiet, but their attention hasn't wavered. The absence of applause or laughter doesn't feel like a lack of engagement. It feels appropriate for the nature of the conversation. Toward the latter part of this segment, one of the co-hosts gently signals a transition, noting that conversations like this are important because they reflect the kinds of discussions happening outside the studio as well. It's a subtle way of acknowledging the depth of what's been said without abruptly changing direction. Whoopi Goldberg gives a small nod, and Depp offers a brief, appreciative acknowledgement. There's a sense that both recognize the value of the exchange, even if their perspectives haven't fully aligned. As Part 3 comes to a close, the overall tone remains consistent, calm, thoughtful, and grounded in the realities of live television. The conversation hasn't escalated into conflict, but it has clearly moved beyond a typical interview. Instead, it has become a genuine dialogue, shaped by experience, perspective, and the shared understanding that these kinds of discussions don't always have simple or immediate resolutions. As the discussion continues, there's a subtle but noticeable shift in how the conversation is being managed at the table. By this point, both Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg have clearly expressed their perspectives, and what follows feels less like introducing new ideas and more like carefully examining what's already been said. On The View, this is often the stage where the hosts begin to guide the segment toward a natural conclusion, while still allowing space for meaningful final thoughts. The pacing reflects that balance. There's a slight tightening of the conversation, but no abrupt changes in tone. One of the co-hosts steps in with a measured observation, noting that what's been discussed reflects a broader cultural moment, where audiences, media, and public figures are all navigating new expectations. It's a framing that doesn't take sides, but instead places the conversation within a larger context. Johnny Depp listens, his posture composed, hands resting calmly. When he responds, his tone carries a quiet consistency with everything he's said so far. He acknowledges that the landscape has changed, particularly in how quickly information spreads and how widely it's interpreted. He emphasizes that this shift has made it more important than ever to approach narratives with care. There's no frustration in his voice, but there is a sense of emphasis, an understanding that the issue he's describing isn't temporary, but ongoing. Whoopi Goldberg nods as he speaks, and when she responds, there's a slight softening in her delivery. She doesn't move away from her earlier points, but she reframes them in a way that feels more reflective than assertive. She speaks about experience, how over time, individuals in the public eye learn to navigate these challenges, even if the process isn't always straightforward. It's a moment that brings a degree of mutual acknowledgement into the conversation. Not agreement, necessarily, but recognition. Another co-host gently introduces a question that aims to bring both perspectives together. She asks how conversations like this, calm, direct, and public, can contribute to better understanding between audiences and public figures. It's a forward-looking question, one that shifts the focus from what has happened to what could happen. Depp takes a moment before answering. He explains that open dialogue is important, but it has to be grounded in listening as much as speaking. He notes that when conversations become one-sided, they lose their effectiveness. His tone remains steady, but there's a quiet conviction in his words. Whoopi Goldberg responds by agreeing with the importance of dialogue, adding that it also requires a willingness to accept discomfort. She explains that not all conversations will feel easy, especially when they involve differing perspectives, but that doesn't make them any less necessary. At this point, the dynamic between them feels more settled. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared entirely, but it has evolved into something more constructive. Each response feels less like a counterpoint and more like an addition to a shared discussion. The audience remains attentive, and while there's still no significant audible reaction, there's a sense that the room is engaged in a way that goes beyond surface-level interest. It's the kind of attention that comes from listening closely, rather than reacting quickly. As the segment moves forward, one of the co-hosts briefly reflects on how viewers at home might be interpreting the conversation. She notes that discussions like this can resonate differently depending on individual experiences, and that part of the value lies in hearing multiple perspectives. This comment subtly acknowledges the broader audience beyond the studio, reinforcing the idea that the conversation extends beyond the set. Depp responds with a brief nod, adding that interpretation is always part of communication, but that clarity can help reduce misunderstanding. He reiterates his earlier point about context, emphasizing that it plays a crucial role in how messages are received. Whoopi Goldberg listens, then adds that clarity is important, but so is accountability in how messages are delivered. Her tone remains calm, and while the point echoes her earlier stance, it feels less like a repetition and more like a reaffirmation. There's a brief moment where both perspectives sit side by side again, clear, consistent, and still not entirely aligned. But instead of creating tension, it highlights the complexity of the topic. The hosts begin to subtly guide the conversation toward its closing moments. There's a slight increase in structure. Questions become more concise, responses more focused. It's a natural progression for a live segment that has covered significant ground. One co-host asks Depp if there's anything he would want audiences to take away from conversations like this. It's an open-ended question, giving him space to offer a concluding thought. He pauses briefly before answering, his expression thoughtful. He speaks about the importance of patience, both in understanding others and in allowing time for clarity to emerge. He avoids making broad statements, instead keeping his response grounded and personal. Whoopi Goldberg listens, and when she offers her own closing thought, it carries a similar tone of reflection. She speaks about the value of conversation itself, how even when perspectives differ, the act of engaging respectfully can lead to greater awareness. At this stage, the atmosphere in the studio feels more settled than it did earlier. The intensity of the discussion has eased slightly, replaced by a sense of completion. The audience begins to respond more visibly, with a light round of applause emerging as the conversation starts to wrap. It's not loud or prolonged, but it signals appreciation for the exchange that has taken place. The hosts acknowledge the moment, some offering brief nods or small smiles. There's a shared understanding that the segment has gone deeper than initially expected, but has remained within the tone and standards of daytime television. As Part 4 draws to a close, what stands out is how the conversation has evolved. It began as a standard interview, shifted into a thoughtful disagreement, and has now settled into a more reflective space where both perspectives have been clearly expressed. There's no dramatic resolution, no clear winner or final word. Instead, there's a sense that the conversation has achieved something more subtle, an honest exchange that reflects the complexities of public life and the challenges of navigating it in real time. And as the show prepares to move into its final moments, the focus turns toward how this discussion will be received, both in the studio and beyond, where viewers will continue the conversation in their own ways. As the segment reaches its final moments, the tone in the studio feels noticeably different from where it began. What started as a routine appearance has evolved into something more reflective, and now there's a clear effort from everyone at the table to bring the conversation to a thoughtful and balanced close. On The View, transitions like this are handled with care. The hosts begin wrapping up not by abruptly changing the subject, but by acknowledging what has just taken place. There's a shared understanding that the discussion between Johnny Depp and Whoopi Goldberg has carried a level of depth that stands out from a typical segment. One of the co-hosts offers a brief summary of the conversation, highlighting the key themes that emerged: perception, accountability, context, and the evolving relationship between public figures and audiences. It's not framed as a conclusion, but as a way to reflect what viewers have just witnessed. Johnny Depp sits calmly, listening as the summary is delivered. His posture remains composed, and when he's given the opportunity for a final remark, he keeps it simple and consistent with the tone he's maintained throughout. He thanks the panel for the conversation, noting that while not every perspective will align, the opportunity to speak openly is something he values. His delivery is steady, without any sense of finality or emphasis beyond what's necessary. It feels less like a closing statement and more like a continuation of the same thoughtful approach he's carried from the beginning. Whoopi Goldberg responds in kind. She acknowledges Depp's presence on the show and reiterates that conversations like this are part of what makes live television meaningful. Her tone is warm, but still grounded, and she briefly emphasizes that differing viewpoints can coexist without needing to be resolved in a single discussion. There's a moment where the two exchange a brief nod, subtle but noticeable. It's not a gesture of agreement, but one of mutual respect. The kind of acknowledgement that often marks the end of a serious but controlled exchange. The audience, which has remained largely quiet throughout the discussion, now responds with a more audible round of applause. It's still measured, in keeping with the tone of the segment, but it carries a sense of appreciation, not just for the guest, but for the conversation itself. The hosts begin transitioning the show forward, briefly mentioning what's coming up next. The shift back into the standard structure of the program is smooth, but there's a lingering sense that the previous segment has left an impression. As the cameras pull back slightly and the conversation at the table relaxes, there are small changes in body language. Some of the hosts exchange brief comments off mic. While Depp offers a polite smile, the intensity of the earlier discussion now eased. But the moment doesn't end when the segment does. As is often the case with conversations like this, the response extends beyond the studio. Shortly after the episode airs, viewers begin sharing their reactions across social media. Some focus on Depp's emphasis on fairness and context, noting how measured his responses were throughout the discussion. Others highlight Goldberg's perspective on accountability and influence, appreciating the clarity and consistency she brought to the conversation. Clips from the segment begin circulating, with particular moments, pauses, key statements, and exchanges drawing attention. The tone of the online discussion largely mirrors what was seen on screen. Thoughtful, at times divided, but generally respectful. Media outlets covering daytime television also pick up on the segment, describing it as a notable exchange that stood out for its calm and deliberate tone. Rather than focusing on conflict, much of the coverage centers on the substance of the conversation and the way it was handled in real time. In follow-up discussions, both perspectives are revisited. Commentators note that neither Depp nor Goldberg attempted to dominate the conversation, and that the lack of interruption or escalation allowed for a more complete exploration of the topic. Back on the show itself, the segment is briefly referenced in later episodes. The hosts acknowledge the response it received and reiterate the importance of open dialogue. There's no attempt to revisit the discussion in detail, but there is a recognition that it resonated with viewers. For Depp, the appearance becomes one of several moments where he has addressed broader themes beyond his work. For Goldberg, it reinforces her role as a host who engages directly with complex topics, even within the structure of a daytime format. What stands out most, however, is how the conversation unfolded. It didn't rely on raised voices or dramatic turns. Instead, it built gradually, through careful listening and measured responses, reflecting the kind of exchange that feels authentic to live television. As the full episode continues to circulate, viewers who watch it in its entirety often note the same thing. The conversation felt real. Not scripted, not exaggerated, but reflective of how people with different perspectives can engage when given the space to do so. And that, in many ways, becomes the lasting impression of the segment. Not a single statement or moment, but the overall tone of the exchange. As we wrap up this breakdown, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.